Welcome back. I hope that you have gotten successfully through the videos for the second literature week of the 396 Myths of Rome course. At this point, we're going to move again away from the historical videos and give some attention to our second author, Livy. We already introduced him in a previous video, and now we're going to look at book one of the early history of Rome, for which you read the translation, and to discuss what Livy does to present his introduction to Roman history. At this point, please pause your video. You need to do two things. First, you need to find your translation of Livy's book one of early history of Rome. You can use, of course, the Penguin translation. And then second of all, please locate under Resources in Sakai the document called Dramatis Personae for Livy, which gives you the list of the major characters in the first book of the early history of Rome. And of course, those characters principally are the seven kings and the associated families and other related characters. So please pause your video and take care of getting a translation out and that document out. Okay, do you have your translation and that document out off Sakai? Okay, we're ready to proceed. So, I gave some attention to the first book of Livy's History of Rome because it presents purportedly the beginning stages of Roman history during the King period, which, as we talked about in the Roman history series, precedes the foundation of the Roman Republic in 510 BC. However, it shouldn't have taken long for you, as you read the first book, to realize that there's quite a bit of mythology interwoven in that historic narrative, especially the telling of the first of the seven kings, Romulus, the one who ended up slaying his brother Remus, the two twins, after their dispute. Romulus ended up becoming the first king and then was subsequently followed by 6 other kings. Now, Romulus is a manifestly mythical figure because he is descended from the god Mars in a rather strange, illicit relationship. And then, of course, his death is rather peculiar because he is spirited away in a cloud of dust. And even Livy rather soberly points out that he doesn't necessarily believe that story actually happened, that it may have been a made-up story to cover an assassination of the King Romulus by the Senate, because Romulus was paying so much attention to the populace as opposed to the interests of the aristocracy. And it's that specific division between the aristocratic patrician element of society and the commoners, the plebs of society, that is in fact going to be a theme through practically all of our Roman history down to the empire, and which is going to be a constant fault line in the running of the Republic that is eventually, after many centuries, going to fracture the entire Roman Republic in the years a little before Livy would have written this history. So, so the seven kings, in fact, although Livy is, of course, primarily interested in biographically detailing what went on with the seven kings, is also a reminder of the Roman readers of their past, for them to recognize that there are some parallels between what went on in their past and what has recently happened in the fall of the Republic and the conversion of the Republic into the Empire. So Livy, in fact, in his opening chapters of the work, before he gets into the history, explains the moral decline that he has witnessed in recent Roman history. And he is at pains to point this out to his readers, so that, just like Thucydides tried to do in his Greek history about the war between Athens and Sparta, the Peloponnesian War, Livy similarly wants to point out the long, illustrious, but also oftentimes bloodthirsty history of the Romans, in order to try to get the Romans to realize that they stand for something much greater than just a group of people, and that they need to raise their standards of moral behavior quite a bit up, now that they are in charge of and responsible for many populaces under the Roman Empire. All right, let's talk about the content of the chapter itself. First is that opening introduction we just mentioned, Livy's lengthy explanation of his purpose of writing the work, which again primarily seems to be a documentation of previous high standard periods of Roman history. That contrasts sharply with the periods of moral decline in his contemporary day. You might observe the important parallel between Livy's historical way of showing the baseness of contemporary times versus the grandeur of older historical times. That is, in fact, paralleled with Catullus' poem that you just completed last week. Catullus' poem, of course, has the grandeur of the Argo and the marriage of Peleus and Thetis and the Trojan War, all these wonderful historical events of the past, as opposed to current times when the gods are so sick and tired of all of the morally based stuff that their subject Romans do, that they've just given up and said, no more, we're not going to have anything more to do with you. So it is frequent for writers to talk about the baseness of contemporary times versus the paradisal period of the past that has subsequently been lost, kind of like a paradise lost kind of theme. So that is a trope that one has to always think about when one reads these works. But it does seem pretty clear, though, that Livy does want to make the history from the early days of the kings illuminate what's been going on in the Republic through quite a few centuries, and probably give some rationale for what eventually doomed the Republic in Livy's own lifetime before seeing Emperor Augustus take over and turn the Republic into an empire. All right, so now we come to the 7 kings themselves. So the first king, of course, is Romulus. He has a few difficulties. First of all, as we've seen, there is the dispute with his brother Remus. The two of them get into an argument over who is going to be the first ruler of the new city of Rome that they've just gotten busy building. And of course, they build the city of Rome after they successfully install their grandfather Numitor back on his throne, because Numitor had been deposed of his position by his evil brother Amulius. So Romulus and Remus team up, and they get Numitor back in power. After his death, Romulus and Remus themselves now are in control, and now they set about building a city. Once they built the city, however, they get into an argument about who is going to rule it first. So they divide up their decision-making process onto 2 hills, each one watching for vultures. As we talked about in a previous video, Remus sees his vultures first, but Romulus sees more of them. The two of them get into an argument again as to which one matters, and the outcome of this very nasty argument is that Romulus slays Remus. The Roman poet Horace, contemporary with Virgil and Livy, wrote an epode, number 16 in his collection, in which he really digs into the Romans for their history that starts off with fratricide, wonderful, glorious ways of getting cities founded. All right, well, Romulus, of course, now does become king. Now, he does some good things. He, for instance, founds the Senate, which consists of 100 elderly citizens in society who become his special council. Because they are referred to as patres, P-A-T-R-E-S, the fathers of their country, all of the families descended from them become the patricians. Everybody else in society becomes the plebeians. These two portions of the society may not intermarry. So patricians, from the first days, are split away immediately from plebeians. Now, that creates the difficulty, however, that there are not enough patrician families to ensure that the Roman society will continue without inbreeding happening up at the top. And this difficulty of inbreeding, including possibly even incest and the madness that results, can also be depicted in later European history if you look at the ruling families, especially the monarchies. It's a common theme that often riddles many of the monarchical or royal families with numerous incidents of madness and acts of violence that result with oftentimes monarchs in power who very clearly should not be there. So here is one of the earliest documented examples we have of the kind of incest that happens. Of course, there also were much older examples that we can see, for instance, with some of the Egyptian pharaohs. But we have a very clear depiction of it here in Livy of what Romulus has to avoid. So Romulus invites in the Sabines. one of the neighboring tribes, into a festival of Neptune. And during the festival, at the point when the sacrifice is supposed to happen, a signal is given with all the women and children assembled in the forum, and the Roman men swoop in and grab away all the Sabines. The result, of course, is a war that breaks out between the Romans and Sabines, the Sabines being ruled by their king Titus Tatius. But eventually, peace is made, ironically, by the women themselves, who do not want to see themselves simultaneously orphaned and widowed. So with that, Romulus's kingship gets finally back on a relatively steady base, because he establishes that very important alliance with the Sabines, and begins also making alliances with cities around. Romulus's death, of course, is very strange. He is out training his soldiers on the campus marches, and all of a sudden he is wrapped up in a cloud and just spirited away. When that happens, everybody believes that Romulus has been spirited away by his father Mars, the war god. However, Livy does point out the alternative explanation, that maybe the story was made up by senators in order to cover their own act of assassination, because they, the patricians, were not happy with the populist measures that Romulus took to look out for plebeians. In all events, one of Romulus's names was Quirinus, and as a consequence of the worship of Romulus now as the first ever deified Roman leader, now that he's on Mount Olympus, Roman citizens come to be known as Quirites, and that particular name continues down through Roman history as an alternative name for the general Roman populace. So when Romulus dies this way, the Senate now holds what's called an interregnum period. Interregnum in Latin is the term for an in-between kingship period. Numa Pompilius then becomes the newly appointed king. He is the one who establishes all of the religious institutions. After his relatively peaceful rule, we have Tullus Hostilius, who expands Rome militarily, especially into the territories of Alba and Fidenae nearby, and he starts making inroads against the Etruscans, and that's, of course, going to be one of the bloodier aspects of Roman Italic relations. After Tullius Hostilius, we get Ancus Marcius, one sort of balance between peace and war, and then we get the three Etruscan rulers. We get Tarquinius Priscus. We get Servius Tullius, who is the king who establishes the census and many other aspects of Roman citizenship. And then finally, of course, the mad king, Tarquinius Superbus the Proud. And it is his son Sextus Tarquinius, who, very much in the manner of Paris with Helen, gets himself to be a guest at the house of the general Collatinus. That's after Collatinus and his men, during one of their campaigns, were boasting about their wives to each other during the feast in the evening. And Collatinus claimed that his wife Lucretia was the most chaste wife everywhere. And after that war ended, Collatinus invited all of his men over to his house, and they were all introduced to Lucretia. And indeed, Collatinus won the bet, because Lucretia indeed had apparently been taking care of domestic affairs very faithfully while he was away. But it's during that visit that Sextus lusts after Lucretia, and then gets himself established as a guest some future day. And it's at night, while he's a guest there, that he sneaks out of his bedroom, sneaks into her bedroom, and holds her at knife point and forces her to submit. She then commits suicide, and her suicide of dishonor then incites a riot against the father of this miscreant, the father Tarquinius Superbus, who had already had a pretty severe and unpleasant reign up to that point, and he is deposed. And with his deposing, the Roman kingship comes to an official, complete end. And although there are some debates about this with later history, effectively the Roman kingship never again gets restored in Roman history. And that's what concludes the first book of the early history of Rome. So it's important to understand that the kings are definitely historical figures that the Romans respect in the cases where these kings did in fact benefit later society, most notably with Numa Pompilius establishing the Roman religion, as in fact is noted in Virgil's Aeneid in Book 6. There's obviously the fact that Romulus himself starts the ancestry of the Roman kings, descended from Mars. Aeneas, prior to him, the Trojan hero who is going to be described so fully in Aeneid, is also a descendant of Venus. So Mars and Venus are considered to be the ancestors of the Julius Caesar, and then, of course, the eventual Emperor Augustus. So those are the positive elements of the kings. But the monarchical rule definitely left a very bitter taste in the minds of later Roman political thinkers. Never again was the word rex free of the distaste of single rule that potentially could go amok and would trample on the rights of ordinary Roman citizens. So once the kingship was eliminated and the republic was established, the Romans were pretty firm about maintaining the solidarity of the republic, and never again would they allow the republic to slip back into kingship. So in fact, when stories about kingship surfaced near the end of the republic, such as, of course, the famous story about Julius Caesar receiving an offer from Mark Antony of a diadem 3 times during a games, and his declining 3 times, but resisting with less resolve each time. This was one of the things that could have gotten a conspiracy against Caesar going if it appeared that he was actually thinking of restoring the monarchy in Roman society, which would have been completely anathema to practically any sane Roman at that time. So the kingship, therefore, is essentially a model for the Romans of what's good about leadership that they should pick up, but also many of the reasons why there aren't kings anymore. Probably no episode, aside from maybe the rape of Lucretia and the rape of the Sabines, is more bloodthirsty and illustrative of the perils of kingship than the unfortunate incident with Tullus Hostilius, the third king, when he is on campaign and he is supposed to be assisted by another king named Mettius, M-E-T-T-I-U-S, but Mettius refuses to participate in that battle unless he can decide in advance which side is likely to win. And it's only when Tullius actually does look like he's about to win that Mettius finally shows up and joins in. Once that happens, Tullius invites Mettius to a special ceremony honoring Mettius' assistance. And when he gets there, he gets quartered, attached to 4 chariots drawn by horses and then torn apart. And Livy makes a very strong comment at that point that this kind of punishment is never used in later Roman history, that these are the old barbaric days of kings, and that type of punishment, even if it might have possibly been somewhat suited to the victim, is in fact completely banned in later history. So Livy resorts to moralizing quite a bit in order to explain the contrast between earlier days when there was immoral behavior carried out that was later discontinued, and the later days when the Romans were, at least ostensibly, more civilized. Well, I hope that this walkthrough of Livy's early history of Rome makes some of the basic points clear. And at this point, we're going to switch away from Livy and switch over to our second of our 2 epic poets, Ovid. We're actually not going to be reading his epic poem quite yet, the Metamorphoses. We're going to be looking instead at his written letters called the Heroides, the women writing letters against the men who have abandoned them. We'll look at that first, and then we'll finally get to our really big masterpiece, Virgil's Aeneid, the following week. Okay, we will see you next week for a new series of videos and a new author.